I work hard all week at the model plane factory, and this hobby is my one escape.
Today I'm going to teach you how to take your painting and weathering of your aircraft to the next level. But as you'll see, not everything went to plan. So stick with me and I'll make sure you don't make the same mistakes I did. When we finished off last time, I'd painted the model in an aluminium colour, and this was to be the basis of my chipping effects that would soon follow. Adding chipping effects to my aircraft, although sometimes I do this in an exaggerated way, is one of my favourite things to do. So I start by adding one light coat of chipping fluid. I have used this technique before with success, but I know that the aluminium base makes the chipping of the paint very easy, so only one coat of the chipping fluid was applied. The belly of the plane is then painted soon after using a mix of RLM 76 as my base colour with a touch of RLM 65 to add a bit of depth to that tone for the first layer. The mix could then be lightened with the RLM 76 and then later with a touch of white to apply some highlights to selected panels. I'm looking to add variation in the light colour because this will present in a more realistic way on the finished model. By keeping the paint thinned at about 70% retarder to paint, it'll make the paint a semi-translucent finish which will help blend it with the rest of that base coat. I move to the top side and apply my layer of RLM 75. Because I'm intending to use the hairspray chipping technique, I'm mindful not to flood the paintwork, and I'm mindful to only paint the areas over the model that need to be painted so as not to create too many layers. Multiple layers of paint can affect the way the chipping fluid will work. I'm speaking theoretically here because you will soon see I have bigger problems than that about to unfold, so take that for what it's worth. You may also notice I'm okay with the coverage being applied in an imperfect way. It comes down to creating variation in the tones in order to try and find a degree of realism in the finished model. There will be numerous layers to follow, so exaggerating the effect here will help some of that show through on the finished kit. Some highlighting was created by lightening that RLM 75 with a touch of white. Now here is where things get funky. My demarcation lines would need to be set using a masking tape, and I soon realised that the tape was pulling off that coloured layer of paint clean off the model due to that layer of chipping fluid I'd applied earlier. This technique had worked in the past because my schemes had always been freehand applied and not masked. So here is the lesson for the unwary modeler. Chipping fluid over a metallic base is not a good idea when masking is required. So it was a matter then of wetting the model to activate that chipping fluid and removing as much of the paint as I could. To further aid in that removal, an industrial strength masking tape was used to help purge the surface of any loose paint and chipping fluid that might have remained. I could then go back to square one and re-establish the RLM 75 shapes and set the masks for that darker colour. RLM 74 from the Real Colour range was carefully applied over the appropriate areas. With control and basic understanding of thinning your paint, you can avoid having to mask your whole model at this point. Keeping the spraying angle at 90 degrees, thinning the paint to around 50-50 thinner to paint, keeping the air pressure at around 15 psi, and working with the airbrush reasonably close to the model surface will give you the best chance of executing the paintwork without fear of overspray. I'm relieved to tell you the masking tape was removed this time, resulting in very little damage to the underlying surface. I could then apply the RLM 74 over the sides of the airframe, following the instruction sheet as best I could. The modelling on the sides and tail was applied freehand. The paint was kept thinner than usual to aid in that application, and that was around 70% thinner to paint. You may notice here I'd managed to break off both machine gun barrels when handling this model, which will have to be addressed at a later time, and why I suggested in the build video to leave them off until the end.
Watch it, son! You're gonna break the wing!
The white identification stripe was masked and sprayed. There is a decal in the kit for this, however painting is always superior to a decal if you're able to execute it this easily. I'd always wanted this model to be an exercise in chipping, hence the aluminium base coat, but with the chipping fluid debacle and that layer now removed, I was procrastinating on the best way of how to chip this model. So what better way to procrastinate even more than to add some highlights to the RLM74 while I was thinking. Fortune favours the brave, so I decided to just go for it and started the effect with a soft sanding sponge. The surface is kept wet with a splash of water and the sponge is rubbed gently over the surface to start wearing away at that top coat to reveal the aluminium. The way the paint removes is surprisingly authentic. A more targeted approach is achieved using a slither of that sponge and a pair of tweezers. I'm working around areas that would have seen traffic and wear. In saying all this, these 410s probably weren't round long enough to suffer all that much wear, but pushing the boundaries with my aircraft brings me joy, and that was good enough for me to justify the treatment. And while sanding was a great start, I needed a more targeted approach with the chipping for some of those areas around the model. I tried a few things but ended up on making a 50-50 mix of water and isopropyl alcohol to use as my activation agent to execute the next round of chipping. The alcohol in the mix will soften the paint to the point where I can chip it using a toothpick. Isopropyl alcohol, or IPA, will destroy the paint pretty quickly, so by diluting it I seem to have found a workable balance. The IPA water mix allowed me to create a targeted and realistic looking paint chip across the model, enhancing some of those areas I'd created using the sanding sponge. It's important to work in small, defined areas so you don't damage or compromise your paintwork. This worked remarkably well and will no doubt come in handy on future models. It does come with a certain level of risk, however, so just take care when trying to use it. And a quick shout out to my latest Wombat warrior, Kyle Williams. Kyle has joined the other Wombats over on the Patreon page and is helping me bring you this content on a regular basis. And of course, thank you to my top tier killer kangaroos. Patreon is free to join, and once on the page you can decide on the tier that suits you best. I value every member on that page no matter what level you choose, so please consider joining the community and let's build something special together.
Oh, don't eat that decal! How many have you had?
If there was one part of building aircraft I hear people complain about the most, it would be the decaling stage. But all of the markings and stencils over the plane make such a difference to the finished model and are generally worth the effort. The model is sprayed in an all-over gloss varnish straight from the rattle can, and once dry, a setting solution is applied to the area I'm applying the decal. Once in place, a softening solution is applied and the decal is carefully pressed in place with a Q-tip and a tissue. All of this process happens over about a 10-minute period to allow that softening solution to do its job. But you can see the result that solution gives you with that decal settling through those panel lines and recesses. Applying the spiral decals to the cones on those propellers was a tricky proposition because they didn't seem to present how the instructions would suggest. So I just let them fall how they wanted and tried to keep them evenly spaced around the cone. This application was a lot easier with the cone off the propeller assembly. Needless to say, the decal softener is crucial here because without it, I wouldn't even attempt to use these decals. A VMS satin varnish is applied then, not only to seal the decals in place, but the satin finish will give me the best surface to apply my weathering effects over. This varnish is so easy to use and so forgiving. I'm able to flood the surface and the product is self-leveling and dries to a perfect satin finish. Panel line washes are always so rewarding because it is the stage where the model starts to come to life. For the underside, I'm using a wash that's designed for a Panzer Grey in the hope that the blue undertone in that paint will complement the blue in the RLM76. The enamel is thinned with a white spirit, or an enamel thinner if you like, and by touching the loaded brush against the panel line will allow that paint to flow through the recesses and add a sense of depth to those shapes. The wash isn't always going to go where you want it, but once it's touch dry, it's easy to tidy up that excess paint by gently rubbing a makeup sponge across the panels. These techniques would be familiar to viewers of this channel, but I think it's important to go over them again. I use them on just about every model I make, but understanding the basics of pin washes will elevate your own modeling greatly. Some paints flow better than others depending on how thin they are, and some just have a more dense pigment content about them. So a trick to help them flow is to coat the model in a light layer of white spirit to help break the surface tension before you begin. A darker colour wash will work better with the colours on the top surface, so a wash designed for NATO vehicles is applied. Because all of my base layers are either lacquers or acrylics, I'm able to confidently layer the enamel over the top without fear of damaging the coloured layers. In turn, that means I can modify or remove any of that excess enamel wash I don't want with that makeup sponge, or if it's a little more stubborn, I can use a brush moistened with white spirit to clean it up. Details like exhausts and the gun barrel were painted using acrylic paints, and the brackets for the external fuel tanks were micro detailed using tape and applying light sponge chipping using a colour called, believe it or not, chipping. Exhaust staining was applied off the exhausts and trailed along the underside of the wings using a heavily thin mix of Tamiya brown and black. Again, I was probably a fraction heavy-handed here, but the flow and the shapes help add a dimension of perceived action and movement to the underside of the model and accentuate the curves and lines in the aircraft. Still going with the enamels, and it was now about creating the look of dirt and debris that had kicked up and splattered along the base of the aircraft when taking off and landing. Achieving this look was a matter of splattering tones of brown enamel paint in the front to back motion. A flat brush is moistened with the paint and flicked across a toothpick to create the speckles. I'm working around and off the back of those wheels where this effect would possibly be distributed in real life. Cleaning any oversize or rogue speckles is easy enough with a brush moistened with a touch of white spirit. The landing gear is treated in a dusty coloured enamel wash to help integrate that weathered look into this part of the model. The paint is applied and allowed to dry and then removed using the makeup sponge just like I did with the pin washes earlier. The dust wash is also applied in a more restrained way to the top side of the wings where the bulk of that chipping was showing. By first applying that paint and then blending it and feathering it using a white spirit, I'm able to soften the effect and make it look like settled dirt from foot traffic. Streaking effects can help tell a story of motion, and they are really easy to create using a small dot of oil paint and then feathering it out using a flat brush. I'm applying the effect around the propeller housing and around the fuel caps and working the paint in a front to back motion again. The paint simulates grease and fuel spills that have elongated and exaggerated once the plane is in motion. The leading edges of the propeller blades were lightly chipped with an aluminium acrylic paint and a sponge and glued in place, and an all-over coat of VMS matte varnish is applied. I had to fight the urge through the build process to remove the canopy masks and have a peek. I think I was looking for some form of guarantee I wasn't wasting hours of time on paintwork and decaling to remove the masks and see some drama going on in the cockpit. And I can't tell you how disappointing it was to see some of the enamel wash had found its way onto the inside faces of the canopy. Obviously a result of those connection points through that canopy not being completely sealed. I could live with a weathered canopy, but I couldn't live with this. I carefully took to the canopy with a sharp blade, a fine razor saw, and even a scribing tool to remove it so I could gain access to clean the blemishes using a Q-tip moistened with white spirit. I've only touched on the process here, but removing the canopy and breaking it down into individual parts was incredibly time consuming and delicate work. But posing the hatches open allowed me to showcase the cockpit, which is something I probably should have considered from the start. The finishing touch was attaching the aerial. The product I'm using is a fine elastic rigging thread I picked up years ago, so I can't share the brand because I just don't recall what it was. The elastic is great because it has a certain level of give in it, so any minor bumps shouldn't damage it. I managed to source some MG131 barrels from Colts 3D and printed myself a substitute set for the gun barrels I'd broken earlier, and then the barrels were polished using a gunmetal pigment powder from Ammo. I always feel the spotlight is on me that little bit more when building aircraft because my knowledge base is so limited and my skill set is different to that of a traditional aircraft builder. But I thought there was value in sharing this journey with you here in the hope that you may find some validation in knowing that even an experienced modeler still makes mistakes. I have to confess there were certain stages of this build I really had to find the faith in the process because after the mistakes I'd made in the build phase and then the debacle of the chipping fluid over that metallic finish, I was contemplating ditching the kit and starting again, or at least going back to my comfort zone of armor modeling and dealing with it at a later date. But trusting the process and working through my challenges one step at a time was totally worth it now I'm here looking at the finished result. Every time I build an aircraft, I immediately have the urge to build another. Maybe it's just because it's something different in the showcase, or maybe I'm just surprised at how well this one came out. What do you guys think? Did you enjoy this build? Would you like to see more aircraft on the channel, or would you prefer I stick with my armor roots? I'd love to hear your thoughts, so please let me know in the comments down below. And if I've added some value today, please remember to hit that like button and be sure you're subscribed. And please be sure to tell your friends and fellow modelers about this channel, and let's grow this community together. Don't forget the competition to win this kit for yourself. Check out the build video for details. It's open to everyone and will be drawn at the end of September. So remember, you've got to be in it to win it. Remember guys, this is the greatest hobby in the world. Share it with your family and share it with your friends, and let's be proud of what we do. Until next time, I'll see you soon.
Watch it, son. You're gonna break the wing. Oh, now you got glue up your nose.